So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about layers and opacity. Okay. Now, this is going to be pretty similar for whatever software that you're working in. I'm going to be showing you this in Procreate for all of these, but these are things that you should be able to transfer to whatever software you're working on, and they should function roughly the same. Okay. So your layer menu right here is going to be where you find all of your menus. Now, layers, you should imagine them like panes of glass stacked on top of each other. Okay, so let's make a couple layers here by hitting this plus sign. Okay, now imagine that each one of these layers is a clear pane of glass. Okay, and when we paint on that pane of glass, let's say we come over here with our blue and we paint down some blue paint here. Okay, we paint this on. Now we go to our next layer. We're going to choose a different color so we can see clearly. Okay, and then the final color will do something like this. Okay, so there we go. We have these three splotches of paint, and each, whoops, we forgot to do the blue on a separate layer. And blue paint. Okay, so each of these splotches of paint are on a separate layer. And if we turn each pane off, or each layer, we can see that they interact differently. Okay? So if we select this layer, we'll only paint on the layer with the red on it. So we can see when we turn that on and off, it's affected that way. Okay? So keep that in mind. Whichever layer is selected is going to be the one you're painting on. So because these are on their own separate panes of glass, we can also rearrange them, right? So let's say I want to move this blue one underneath the light teal one. Now that is the lowest pane of glass, and the red shows up on top of everything else, and we can move that around as well. Okay? Also, since these are all on separate layers, if we want to erase something, we can erase them separately on their own layers like this. Okay, so I'm just erasing the blue, but it's leaving behind the, or I'm just erasing the teal, but it's leaving behind the red and blue, as you can see. Okay, so that's how layers function. Now, each layer also has layer modes, which we're going to go into in another lecture, but for now, we're just going to talk about just the layers and how to move them around. Okay, you also have your background layer, which is basically just a base layer with the background, and all you can do is change the color. You can turn that off so that the background's transparent, and you can see it's just doesn't have any sort of background, which if you want to export your image as a PNG, it will export without any sort of a white background, just whatever pixels you've put down on the canvas. Okay, and then lastly, let's talk about opacity. Opacity is going to be how opaque or transparent something is. So in Procreate, what you can do is either come up here to your adjustments menu and hit opacity and then slide to adjust that, or you can just tap on two fingers on the layer and adjust it that way. Okay, but opacity is going to determine exactly what I said, how opaque or transparent it is, and this is going to have a lot of uses for you. Okay, let's say maybe you do a layer with some highlights on it, and you decide afterwards that maybe the highlights were a little bit too bright, right? Let's say we're just throwing some highlights on this shape here, give a little bit of three-dimensionality. All right, so we throw these highlights on, and we're like, that looks good, but it's too bright. We could just lower the opacity, and then it's not as strong. Okay, that's what you're going to use opacity for. Keep in mind, at least if you're working in Procreate, if you have something selected like this, and then you lower the opacity, oops, let's do this actually. If you use your lasso tool and you have a portion selected, we want to make sure that we're on freehand, not automatic. You have a portion selected like this, and you lower the opacity, it will stay, it's going to stay permanent for just that selection, so that when you deselect, it's going to show that the layer opacity is at full, and you won't be able to go back and bring the opacity all the way up. So if you could see the part that was in this selection, it's permanently has the opacity lowered. Even though our opacity is at 100%, it's because it was within that selection, while the rest of the highlights, which are down the bottom right, are still at full opacity. Okay, so if we go back, I could show you normally if we leave the opacity down and then we exit that and go on and do something else, we can always come back and raise the opacity. But if you have something selected and you do that, it won't be the same. So just keep that in mind. Anyways, that's it for opacity and layers, and I'll see you guys in the next lecture.